Great. Good afternoon, everybody. Greetings from Geneva. My name is Tony Consul. I'm the head of communications here at IATA. Pleasure to welcome you to this briefing, which is the first with our new Director General, Willie Walsh. Today, the topic will be February traffic results. We'll start with a short presentation by our Chief Economist, Pearce. Then Willie Walsh will have a few remarks, and then, as usual, we'll throw it open to Q&A via the chat function. So with that, Brian, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Tony, and good day, everybody. If we could move to the first slide. I guess the story of February is one of cargo strength, but unfortunately a deterioration in air travel. You will notice that in the publications we are comparing monthly levels against 2019 pre-crisis levels rather than a year ago because of the distortion that would happen otherwise. So cargo was up 9% in February compared to pre-crisis levels. Domestic air travel, domestic RPKs were down 51%. And international air travel, where we've really seen very little recovery at all, was actually down 88.7%. So overall air travel was down 74.7%. So effectively, air travel overall, you were just seeing at the start of this year 25% of the normal levels of travel that we normally have. So we go to the next slide. So moreover, the load factors that airlines are achieving on that travel are really low, particularly international air travel, where yields are desperately low at only just over 40%, as you can see here. If you're an airline operating principally in domestic markets, so the US, China, perhaps Australia, you're in a better position. Load factors are in the mid-60s, approaching 70. And if you're a cargo airline, you're experiencing strong load factors. It's on the left scale here. It's up near 60%. Unfortunately, the cargo business for most airlines is too small to offset the extremely weak passenger revenue situation. So if we can move to the next slide. So the strength of cargo is really a reflection of what we've seen happening in the wider economy. Economists are getting actually increasingly positive about the wider economy. And we've seen this V-shaped recovery in global industrial production. Economic activity is now back to or above pre-crisis levels, unlike the situation in the air passenger market, but it's certainly pulling up cargo demand. However, it's also pulling up energy costs. And you can see that airlines are now having to pay more than $70 a barrel for jet fuel prices, which is almost as expensive as it was before the crisis. And clearly that's making it more challenging to get back to cash positive operations. Move to the next slide, please. But even on the cargo business, which is positive, there's a lot of variation across trade lanes. And you can see here that the strongest trade lanes are those connecting Asia and Europe across the Middle Eastern hubs and across the North Pacific between the strong US economy and China, which is also strong as well. But contrast that cargo strength with what's happening between Europe and Asia, and actually indeed across the North Atlantic, where the levels of the cargo business, cargo traffic, is still 5 to 10% below pre-crisis levels. And if we move to the next slide, we're still in the cargo business facing a capacity challenge. The black line shows where capacity is compared to pre-crisis levels, still 10% down. You can see that freighters are operating, extremely well. The traffic carried by the freighter fleet is perhaps 30% up on what we saw last year. Whereas, as you can see, the passenger fleet, and recall that in normal times, 50% or more of cargo travels in the holds of passenger aircraft. Capacity is still extremely low, perhaps 40% down, because much of the passenger fleet, particularly the wide-bodied aircraft, are still grounded. And if we move to the next slide, we can see why. Travel restrictions, and this is the measure of travel restrictions, international travel restrictions Oxford University calculate. You can see that they're still extremely high. And indeed, in January, with the emergence of the variants of the COVID virus, we saw a tightening of those restrictions. It's really only in the Africa and Middle East region where we've seen some relaxation since then. Even there, travel restrictions are still much higher than they were before the crisis. We move to the next slide. Obviously, what's going to change that is vaccination. And if we look at this vaccination forecasts, which shows the timing when vaccination in particular countries will get to certain parts of the population. So the end of the green bar, at the end of those bars, is when 75% of the population is vaccinated according to Airfinity. As you can see, it's very variable. And that's going to mean that we're facing a situation where borders for international travel are not all going to open at the same time. We still think that there's a good chance that there should be markets in the advanced economies opening in the second half of this year. As you can see, between Europe and North America, so the transatlantic market as well. According to these vaccination forecasts, governments should be in a position to open those markets in the second half of the year. But many markets, particularly to emerging economies, will necessarily remain closed until the vaccination rollout moves further. So I think that's the positive aspect of the second half of this year. However, if we move to the next slide, getting to that point is really difficult. And we're seeing with the new cases of COVID-19 that we're going through a third wave here in Europe. As you can see, cases are rising steeply. The same is true in Latin America. Really, the only exception, apart from China and other parts of Asia, is the US, where vaccination has rolled out very substantially. We're seeing the benefits of that in that market. But you can see from the next slide the impact that this is having on international travel. So this shows a number of the main markets, international travel markets, shows RPKs on those markets. And you can see there is pent-up demand. You can see what happened in Europe in the summer last year. It went from 0 to 60% of 2019 levels very quickly, but it's back down to very low levels. And the only markets where we had been seeing some international travel in Latin America are now heading downwards as the virus worsens. And the majority of international air travel markets, as you can see, are actually less than 15% of their pre-crisis levels. But if we move to the next slide, there is clearly, I think, evidence of pent-up demand, not just in that intra-European example, but you can see here that domestic markets are showing that people want to travel. The Russian market is back to pre-crisis levels, again, after some fluctuation. I guess the exception is China, where we'd seen complete recovery by the second half of last year, and we're now 50% down. But I think that's almost entirely explained by the government's stay-at-home policy during the Chinese New Year. We know from flight data and other information that there's a rebound in March. And indeed, if you look at some of the other domestic markets, most notably Australia, we are seeing a recovery. So there is demand when restrictions allow people to travel. But obviously the critical thing for airlines' cash flow, as you can see, this chart shows bookings. The critical thing for cash flow is the summer travel season, the northern summer travel season. What we've looked at here are bookings for that period, for the travel during May to September this year, compared to bookings the the same time in 2019, so pre-crisis. So it gives you an idea of to what extent travel will recover compared to pre-crisis levels. I mean, what I would say is that we have seen consumers booking much later, much nearer to the travel date. Pre-crisis, we had 50% of bookings completed more than 3 weeks ahead of the travel date, whereas now, last year, 45% of people are booking within a week. So this is not a complete picture. But what it does show is the big differences that are starting to emerge. I think the situation looks very encouraging in North America. We're seeing a sharp rise in bookings, particularly domestically, and to some extent in the rest of the Americas as well. But contrast that with Europe and Asia, particularly on international markets, where at the moment bookings are extremely low. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Brian. Now I'd like to turn the floor over to Willie Walsh, our Director General, who just joined us on the 1st of April. So this is his first press conference. He'll have a few short remarks before we open the floor to questions. So Willie, over to you.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you, Brian, for your presentation, and good afternoon, everybody. I think as you've seen from Brian's presentation, we're really seeing two industries operating within one, with a significant divergence between what's happening on the cargo side of the business and what's happening on the passenger side. As Brian showed in his presentation, cargo volumes were up by 9% in February. So clearly demand for air travel or air cargo, air freight is quite strong. And as you know, in a normal year, as Brian mentioned, a lot of the cargo that airlines carry is carried in the belly hold of the passenger aircraft. And in some cases, like North Atlantic or transatlantic, that's as much as 55% of the cargo that's carried. And with the significant constraints on the passenger networks, we're seeing supply on the cargo side being constrained as well. So we have good demand, good volumes, but limited capacity. And that capacity will remain limited so long as airlines can't operate their passenger aircraft to carry passenger traffic. What we're seeing on the passenger side is clearly very challenging. And I don't need to say this, but this is the most challenging crisis the industry has ever faced. I speak from personal experience, having spent over 40 years in the industry. But if you look at the figures that Brian talked about with the international passenger traffic down almost 89%, and showing no signs of recovery in the current environment. What we do see, and this was borne out by some of the figures you saw in the presentation again from Brian, like what happened in the domestic market in Australia and what happened in Europe last summer, is that when these constraints are removed, when the restrictions that governments have imposed are either relaxed or removed, there is very strong pent-up demand. So we are optimistic that as we go through the health crisis associated with the pandemic and come through that, and these restrictions are relaxed or removed, we will see passenger traffic recover and recover strongly. And while we fully acknowledge and understand the political need for governments to impose these restrictions, we believe it's very important that governments start thinking and planning for the removal of restrictions as the health crisis is overcome. So we want to work with governments so that they can better understand what will be required from airlines, because it's not going to be easy for airlines just to ramp up activity. That will have to be done in a structured way, because clearly all airlines, and we representing the industry, want to see that done in a coordinated and in a safe fashion. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and we stand ready to work with governments and other agencies to ensure that the recovery can be managed well, and that people can get back to enjoying the freedoms that we've taken for granted. And I think that's a critical issue for all of us. And it's also important for us to recognise that while the future is uncertain, the near term, we want to get back to a situation whereby these restrictions that we see in place today, where passenger travel is allowed, such as testing or the potential for showing vaccine certification, that these requirements are removed. These should not become a permanent part of the industry. These are measures that may be necessary as temporary arrangements while we go through this crisis. But once we're through it, we want to see these restrictions permanently removed so that people can get back to travelling as they experienced back in 2019. So I know you've enjoyed the presentations that my predecessor, Alexander, has given over the last few months, and from all the feedback I've received, you welcome these presentations and clearly value them, and given the attendance on today's call, I think that continues to be the case. So I'm happy to say that looking at the list of attendees, I know most of you. I think I've probably met nearly all of you at some stage in my former roles as Aer Lingus, British Airways or IAG. So I'm happy to continue to do this, and Tony will arrange future briefings. We may not do it on a weekly or fortnightly basis, but we will certainly do it when we have something to say. And believe me, there are a lot of things we will want to say. My priorities remain the same as Alexander. We're clearly focused on working with governments to enable airlines to get moving again. We want to facilitate our member airlines being able to operate, and it's important that the IATA Travel Pass is introduced and accepted, because we need to be able to offer the customer a digitized option to travel. We can't have a situation where passengers are required to go to a check-in counter at an airport when they want to travel, because quite honestly, the airports that we're operating in today aren't designed to cope with high volumes of passengers turning up at check-in desks. The concept of self-service check-in using online or apps has become a permanent feature of the business, and we need to get back to facilitating that. And that's where our initiative on the IATA Travel Pass is so important. We clearly want to see the industry getting back up to full speed in a safe and coordinated way. And we want to see the rest of the value chain recognise the need to work with us. We cannot accept, and we will not accept, monopolistic type behaviours from key elements of the value chain who may seek to recover their losses that they've incurred through 2020 from the industry as we do get going again. And as I said, I would like to see that while testing and the potential for maybe vaccination certificates could be a feature in the short term, we want to see those requirements removed as soon as the health crisis and pandemic crisis has been managed and we get through the immediate challenge that we face. So on that, I'm going to hand back to Tony, who will manage the Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Willie. We have several questions in the queue, so we'll take them in order. The first I think we'll look at is just an overall question. What Brian introduced is not the brightest in terms of outlooks for the industry. So the question is, what are your first activities or actions or directives as you join IATA?
Yeah, thank you. As I mentioned, they're pretty much the same as those outlined by Alexander. We want to see the industry get back to speed because we know that the demand exists. Once these restrictions are removed or eased, and I believe they can be, it's clear that there are some challenges remaining as we see a potential third wave in Europe. But I think vaccination should help to reduce the health emergency that governments are worried about. And once we see those issues being overcome, we do recognise that testing is going to be a feature of the industry, but we do believe that there are options to the PCR test. We want to see other forms of testing that are equally reliable, significantly cheaper and faster, and more comfortable indeed for customers to undertake, embraced by governments. So we would challenge the need for ongoing use of PCR as the, in effect, the sole testing method that has been used. We want to see if vaccination certification is required, that can be done in a digital way, so that we can continue to allow passengers to check in online or use the apps to check in and remove the pinch points at airline check-in desks. And the same would apply when our customers arrive at airports going through immigration. So, we want to see our customers enjoy a smooth travel experience. We clearly recognise the need for many of our members to receive further financial assistance as we go through this, because I think it's in the interest of everybody, consumers and governments alike, that we have an airline industry and a competitive airline industry in place once we get through this crisis. And as I mentioned in my opening comments, we need to be very careful that others don't try and exploit a weak airline industry by seeking to recover their losses. And I'm principally looking at some airports and air traffic control suppliers who have already shown evidence of their desire to recover the monies that they've lost through 2020. It's not going to be possible for the airlines to do that. It shouldn't be possible for suppliers in the industry to do that. And clearly we want to work with governments. We're here to work with others to make this happen, to help to re-establish economic growth and to maintain the economic recovery that Brian outlined, because we firmly believe that economic recovery and growth will not be sustainable without an efficient air transport system. And until we get that, I think aspects of the economic growth that we've taken for granted prior to this pandemic will remain challenged. So, as I said, principally this the very same objectives that Alexander had. I will also be, focusing on what we need to do internally within IATA to make sure that we're absolutely focused on serving and representing the member airlines of IATA.
Okay, thank you very much, Willie. We have a question that also talks about some of the asks we've been making of government in terms of financial relief, and particularly in reference to the recent announcement of support for Air France. And the question is, do you prefer direct support from governments, loans, tapping the market, and do you see any problems with the government holding stakes in airlines as we come out of the crisis?
No, I don't see any problem with governments holding stakes in airlines. Many governments already hold stakes and in some cases exercise influence over airlines. So this is nothing new. I've run an airline that was owned by the government, but it was an airline that competed very aggressively with the likes of Ryanair when I was running Aer Lingus based in Dublin. So our industry will remain competitive. I think it's fair to say that airlines will access any forms of support that they can get. You've seen airlines tap the capital and debt markets, the equity and debt markets. They've received government grants, government aid, loan guarantees. All of this is very welcome, and all of it is necessary. This is a severe crisis, the likes of which we've not seen before. And as Brian showed in his presentation, we can continue to see the industry bleed cash. And, without cash, there will be no industry. So, we accept that all forms of aid need to be accessed, and we welcome it and will continue to welcome it. I think what will be important is our reliance on competition regulators around the world to ensure that any form of aid that has been received does not distort competition when we come through this. I don't think that's in anybody's interest. And I've never heard any of the member airlines in IATA ask for that. So we want to see an industry that competes on a fair and transparent basis, and we want to get back to a normal form of operation as quickly as possible. But that is going to take some time. And given the debt burden that airlines have had to shoulder as we've gone through this. It will take some time for airlines to be able to repay the debt that they have taken on and get back to remunerating shareholders as they have been doing prior to the crisis.
Okay, thanks, Willie. We have another question about governments, and basically it's asking, do you believe that governments are listening to the airlines, the airports, and the travel industry in terms of their needs for this crisis? If so, are they acting correctly? And if not, why do you think they're not acting or listening?
I think it's fair to say that a lot of governments are listening, and indeed a lot of governments are already acting. I don't think it's the same right across the world. I think there are some great examples that we can point to. I travelled to Singapore recently, and they're very keen, as you would expect, given the importance of Changi as a global hub and the importance of Changi and air transport and air cargo to their economy. They want to see international air travel recover as soon as is possible, and they want to see that done in a safe and efficient manner. And we know from talking to our member airlines that they're having good dialogue with governments. Some of this has been done in private. Some of it you will hear about publicly. But I think there's a clear understanding that the global economy requires global connectivity. And while this technology is great, I'm staring into a camera. I don't know if you're actually listening to me or enjoying or challenging what it is I'm saying. So I'd much prefer to be sitting in front of you as we used to do, holding these conferences face to face. And I know from all of my dealings and the conversations that I've been having with people around the world, we want to get back to being able to travel, not just for business. People want to be able to visit their friends and relatives. People want to be able to take a holiday. These are things we all took for granted. These are freedoms that we enjoyed, freedoms that we assumed would always be there, and freedoms that people want back. And we want to support people globally in getting those freedoms back. So I think it's fair to say that governments understand that. I think the public mood recognises the need to prioritise the health agenda, and that's something that everybody supports. But as we see, vaccines being rolled out and the clear evidence that these vaccines are effective, people would naturally expect to see the restrictions that they've had to endure and put up with, in most cases willingly. They want to see those restrictions removed. And that's exactly what we want to see. And that's the message that we're giving to governments. It's the message we're getting from the people that we talk to, and all of the polling that we've done supports that view.
Okay, thanks, Willie. We have sort of a follow-up question to that. You mentioned Singapore as being particularly forward-looking in the crisis. Are there any other governments that you feel are in the lead in terms of trying to get the world back to travel again?
I don't want to criticise governments at this stage. I think there will be time and opportunity for that later, where we see people lagging behind. What we do want to see, though, is a situation where governments are looking at one another and evaluating best practice. We know that there are measures that can be put in place, and indeed have been put in place, to facilitate international travel. It is possible to travel internationally to some countries, and it's restricted to others. So, the challenge is the same pretty much everywhere, and yet some countries have almost permanently closed their borders, both to their own nationals, or made it very difficult for them to return. In the case of Australia, it's been well documented. And then there's other countries like Canada, where Canadian citizens and residents can return, but foreign nationals can't. Who would have seen a situation where Europe was reintroducing borders the way it has done? So I think there are examples of where governments are facilitating travel, using testing as a means of facilitating travel. And there are others who have very effective track and trace mechanisms in place, that are embraced by all of their people. So I think there's a lot of good things you can look to. The critical message, though, is, while we accept these measures in the short term and understand that some of these are necessary, we don't believe that this should be a permanent feature. We believe it's important that we get back to a normal world where people have the freedom to travel as they experienced prior to this pandemic.
Okay, thanks, Willie. In your opening remarks, you mentioned a potential risk of monopolistic behavior. We have a couple of questions asking if you have any specific concerns on that or any specific examples of the types of risks that you see. And then more specifically, does that also include the leasing sector, and are you concerned about consolidation in the leasing sector?
I'm not concerned about consolidation in the leasing sector. It's a pretty fragmented industry, and even the recent announcement of AirCap and GCAS, doesn't represent a significant percentage of the supply from the lessors. I think generally the leasing industry is competitive. There are lots of options out there for most, if not all, airlines, and we continue to see evidence of that. In fact, it would be fair to say that in many cases, lessors have been part of the solution to the cash crisis that airlines have faced through 2020, because you've seen a lot of sale and leaseback activity going on. And in most cases, these have been, from personal experience, I've been at rates that I would have considered to be normal or near normal. So I don't have concerns about the leasing industry at this stage. If I look at our traditional problems in this area, it's the likes of airports like Heathrow, who've clearly demonstrated that they want to try and recover lost revenues. Now, we expect the regulator in the UK to be very tough, to take a stand, particularly where it's trying to recover money spent on the development of a third runway that, wasn't really supported by the industry. It was something that Heathrow wanted to do. We see evidence of air traffic control suppliers who have not looked at improving the efficiency of their operation, given the opportunity that they've had going through this crisis in 2020 with the significant fall of traffic. So we see evidence of some of them trying to recover costs, because in effect some of these guys just act as monopoly suppliers. There is no alternative. We will be very strong and aggressive in opposing this, and we will work with our member airlines to ensure that these suppliers don't take advantage of the situation. And we will expect economic regulators and governments to recognise the need to step in and ensure that this sort of behaviour is, which is clearly not acceptable, but is not tolerated.
Okay, thanks, Willie. We have a couple of questions around the IATA travel pass. So basically, is it moving forward as fast as you've expected? Are there any issues? And particularly, do you think you're getting enough support from the US carriers in the initiative?
Well, I'm pleased with the way it's developing. It's got the full focus of everybody in IATA. I've made it internally one of the key issues that we need to deliver on. The Board of Governors is very supportive and has ensured that sufficient funds are made available to IATA to enable us to develop it. We're working with others to ensure that this can be done in as efficient a way as possible. I'm delighted to see the government of Singapore come out and publicly state that they will use it. I think that's a very positive development. We're trialling it with more airlines. I think we've got 25 airlines now in total who are trialling it. So the more we trial it, clearly, the better the feedback we get. It's a very, very simple operation, very easy for customers to use the app. We try to make it as simple as possible, but more importantly, it's very secure because you, the customer, the passenger, holds the data, and you choose when or if you want to provide it. And that's the beauty of this. There's no central storage of your sensitive data. You're the person holding the data. So I think it's a very important development because, as I've said, we've all become used as airline customers to self-service checking in online using the app. These are fantastic features. They made it much more comfortable for people to get through the airports. And airports today aren't designed to handle high volume of customers at check-in desks. So it's essential that we need it. So we'll be working with airports and regulators and governments to fully exploit this. And, we're quite happy if others provide alternative solutions. That's great. Our desire is to ensure that our member airlines have a solution, that they don't have to design it themselves, or that they don't have to pay a high price to get a solution that works for them. So, we're not looking to monopolize this area. Quite the opposite. We're happy to see others develop alternatives as well. But we believe it's incumbent upon us to provide our member airlines with a solution. So, some of our airline members may choose to use an alternative. That's fine by us. But many of our airline members will need it, won't have the choice, won't have the option of another supplier. And that's why we're here. We're here to support them and give them the means that they require to be able to operate.
Okay. Thanks, Willie. You mentioned that you want the travel restrictions that are in place to be temporary, and that we should get back to a normal way of traveling. With respect to those, as well as the broader restrictions on entry requirements, what data points or what triggers do you see, or are you proposing to governments to indicate when those restrictions should be lifted?
No, we're not proposing them at this stage, because what we want to see is the airlines moving again, and we want to be able to demonstrate then that this is a safe way of operating. But if you think back, when we saw the liquids ban introduced, which was introduced for a credible security reason, it's still in place today, despite the fact that there is technology available to airports to enable you to leave your liquids in the bag. And in fact, some of you will have seen that. Many airports have the technology to be able to screen bags as we used to in the past without having to take everything out. And that's the important point here. We see as our industry regulations being introduced to address what often are temporary problems, but these regulations remain in place far too long and well beyond the point where they're necessary to ensure a safe and secure operation. And that's why we're confident that once we get through this, these requirements that we accept may be necessary today will not be necessary in the future. And it shouldn't be the case that just because these measures have been introduced that they remain in place. We should have regulations that are relevant to the challenges, to the threats, to the risk that the industry face. We should all the time be looking at solutions and actions that mitigate against those risks. And when we find solutions, be it technology or other measures that can be taken that mitigate the risk that was identified, then the temporary measures should be removed and we should get back to normal. So there's work to be done on this. But I think it is important that we, as consumers, as people who are going to be using travel for, the purpose of, be it for business, for visiting friends, for taking a holiday, that we don't expect that this is going to be a permanent feature of the industry. And we need to challenge that, because I don't believe it will be necessary in the future.
Okay, thanks, Willie. A slightly different tact. Question is, how can the industry best use the pause in traffic growth and the path to recovery to also reset how it addresses environmental challenges?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one of the key issues that we as an organisation will be addressing. We're having regular dialogue with our member airlines. This was an issue debated at length by the Board of Governors at its recent board meeting. So it's very clear that focus on the environmental performance of our industry remains as strong as ever. I'm delighted that member airlines remain just as focused today, and in fact even more so than they were before this crisis, on the need to demonstrate our commitment to delivering on the promises that we've made. And indeed, we've seen more and more airline groups even recently, I think it was last week or maybe earlier this week, Airlines for America came out and said that they are committing to net zero by 2050. So, the challenge remains. We're up for that challenge. We believe that we have a credible path to demonstrate that as an industry we can address everything that will be required of us. And we're absolutely committed to working together. You will see some short to medium term benefit with the retirement of older aircraft. A lot of the older, less fuel efficient aircraft have been retired through 2020 and won't come back into operation. So the fleet that will operate in 2021, 2022 and beyond will be much more efficient than the fleet that was in place in 2019. Now, that's an acceleration of some of the change and the improvement that we wanted to see. But I'm also very encouraged by the ongoing commitment to the development of sustainable aviation fuels. And more recently, with some of the aircraft and engine manufacturers, the likes of Airbus, for example, talking about hydrogen aircraft by 2035. So we know there's technological solutions. We will be pushing the key suppliers in our industry to advance everything that they're doing to ensure that we can not just achieve and exceed the challenges and the targets that we've set, but to look to significantly improve on that. And I can tell you from talking to member airlines, they're fully on side. They're clearly nervous about the cost to the industry. But, this is an industry that has overcome huge challenges in the past, has a great story to tell, and, we'll be very clear in ensuring that people understand exactly what it is we're doing going forward.
Okay, thanks, Willie. We have a couple of questions around the UK's Global Travel Task Force and the anticipated recommendations. So the first is, what are you expecting to come from that? Are there any priority markets that you think should be focused on in terms of green lists? And in general, do you see the way that the UK is approaching a travel restart as being a model for others to follow?
I think what the UK is doing is positive, setting out a roadmap, having clear dates and targets for implementation. I'm sure many people, I was disappointed listening to the Prime Minister when he was giving his conference on Monday that he didn't announced that international air travel would start on the 17th of May. I think a lot of people expected that the introduction of a traffic light system. But I remain positive that this task force will come out with sensible recommendations. But I think we do have to recognise that the UK is looking to have particular milestones, clear criteria that they will use to assess progress and make decisions based on the criteria that they've identified. And in fact, that's what we asked for early on in this. We asked for governments to tell us, what are you looking at? What are you looking for? Help us to understand, what we need to do to enable traffic to get moving again. So, I'm optimistic that the report will be positive, and I'm optimistic that we will see a sensible system introduced. What will be critical, and I think everybody is saying this, is that when it's introduced, that people have some certainty around its implementation. What we don't want to see, as we've seen before, is people believing that they're safe to travel to a certain destination, only to find out as soon as they've got there that the rules have changed. So there has to be a lead-in time. You cannot expect people to be able to respond to these changes. And the data is clear and evident to everybody. So if decisions are going to be based on data, then there should be sensible margins that will enable decisions to be implemented and maintained for the period that it has been identified, without getting these sudden shifts in policy and behaviour.
Okay. We take that question a little bit further, and there's a couple of questions around the transatlantic market. How optimistic are you that we could see a US-UK corridor developing in the near future? And then also, how important is a restart or a reopening of the US to international travel to the overall industry?
I think the US is important to everybody, and we've seen, looking at the figures from the US domestic market that Brian showed in his presentation, that you have people who are very comfortable traveling internally within the US. Those people, many of them, will be equally comfortable traveling internationally. I think it's fair to say that the relationship between the UK and the US has always been strong. There are very strong economic ties, and it would be natural to assume that both governments would want to see connectivity restored as soon as possible. And given the pace at which the vaccine rollout has taken place in the US, which is incredible, given what has been achieved in a short period of time, and in the UK, I think that should give people reasons to be optimistic about transatlantic travel between the UK and the US starting in a safe manner in the near future. So I think it is important. I think it will send a signal to the rest of the world. It will clearly build confidence within the industry and build confidence within those who are supporting the industry. It's a very important, always has been a very important market for everybody, not just carriers based in the UK and the US, but for all transatlantic traffic. So I think it'd be an excellent indication to people that things are improving and that there is reason to be optimistic for the rest of the international network.
Okay. And then a couple of questions that are focused on Europe. Europe seems to be going through some difficulties, particularly with a potential third wave. How optimistic are you, first off, that we will have a European summer travel season? And secondly, what would your expectations for recovery in Europe be?
Well, I think we should remain optimistic that the second half of this year will be much more positive than we've seen so far. It's still early in the year. We're only in April. We've seen some of these trends change, but I think the expectation of vaccine rollout accelerating should be one of the reasons why we can be optimistic that things will start to improve. And I think in most cases, or certainly in a lot of cases, the initial crisis that countries faced with the risk of their health systems being overrun, I think those challenges are easing a bit. With the medical improvements that have been made in treating this virus continue to improve. So I personally think that we should remain optimistic about a summer holiday season for those in Europe. And I know I speak personally. I'm not somebody who normally takes holidays, but I'm definitely going to take one as soon as I can this year because I want to get back traveling. I've missed it. I have been traveling recently for business, but there are a lot of things that I want to do. There are a lot of friends that I've not seen, and I'm sure I speak for a lot of people that taking a holiday is going to be a well-deserved break, and they're really looking forward to it. And as much as we can enjoy staycations, speaking as somebody who's lived in Ireland for a lot of my life, it's a beautiful country and it's great to visit. But every now and then it is nice to see some sunshine, and we don't tend to get a lot of that in Ireland. So, I think it's good for the body, it's good for the soul to get a break every now and then, and I'm optimistic that we will see that in the second half of this year.
Okay, we have another slightly different angle on the crisis. It's asking, what do you think the crisis is doing on the relationship between airlines and unions, and do you see that changing, and what do you see the future looking like?
I think it's a good question because there has been clear cooperation that maybe wasn't as evident prior to the crisis. But in many cases, airlines and unions work closely with one another, overcoming challenges. the industry has been forced to restructure. I know some people argued back in February, April, March of 2020 that this was a temporary issue and it would all be over by the end of the year. That clearly hasn't been the case. I remember saying that I didn't believe we would get back to 2019 levels of traffic until 2023 or 2024. There's some people who would say that's been very optimistic given where we are today. I think recovery, when it does happen, will happen quickly, but we do have to recognise that it's not going to be easy to get back to the same levels because, as we mentioned earlier, a lot of aircraft that were in operation in 2019 have now been retired, and I don't see those aircraft coming back into service. So I see an industry that will be smaller in the short term as it gradually recovers. Clearly, some airlines will take advantage of the recovery. But in most cases, where airlines have embarked on restructuring, it's because it had to happen. Without it, they'd be out of business. And the recovery will take some time. In fact, I think once we get going again, Brian showed in his presentation the passenger load factors on flights that are operating today are very low. In most cases, these are probably cash positive. They're covering the cash cost, but with fuel prices rising, that's going to become an increasing challenge. So, we will see a cash burn even when the industry is starting to recover. It'll be some time before we get back to a situation where the industry is able to be confident of being profitable again. And in that situation, I think it's in everybody's interest to work together. So I don't think things have significantly changed. Maybe in some places it has, but what I've seen is a willingness by people working in the industry to embrace the need for change and recognise why it has to be done, and that's been achieved in most cases in good cooperation between employees and management teams, labour and the management in a lot of the airlines and a lot of the members that we have.
Okay, thanks, Willie. We have a fairly general question, but just asking, what do you see our member airlines asking of IATA in the crisis? What are their top priorities for the association?
Yeah, it won't surprise you to know, where we can work on their behalf to assist them to reduce their costs, where we can work on their behalf to resist the efforts on some suppliers to increase costs, which is total madness in this environment, where we can work on their behalf to demonstrate to governments that it is possible to operate internationally, where we can point to best practice, where we can support them with the developments like the travel pass, where we can ensure that the critical systems like the BSPs that we operate remain robust and remain cost effective for them. So it's all going to be around ensuring that we're representing them, we're serving them, we're doing it in the most efficient way, we're helping them to reduce their costs, we're helping them where we provide services to provide those services in the most cost effective way. It won't come as a great surprise that every airline management team around the world wants to see better quality at lower prices, and that's what we're striving to do at IATA, to continually look to reduce the cost of the services that we supply to our members, but to do it with increasing quality. And we've got a great track record. We've done that very well, and I think great credit to everybody in IATA, especially those operating our settlement systems through 2020.
Okay, thanks, Willie. We have a couple of questions about, again, government support for the industry, relief for the industry. And as the crisis is lasting longer than most anticipated, some of the relief packages will be running out. Do you see a need to go back to governments again? Do you think the industry is about ready to be able to stand on its own feet? How do you see that whole situation playing out?
No, I don't think the industry is ready to stand on its own feet at the moment. On an industry level, there are clearly players within the industry that are. There are people who were quicker to access markets than others were more attractive to both the debt and capital markets. But in the main, I would expect governments to recognise that this has gone on longer than anybody anticipated, and therefore it would be normal to expect an extension to the period that, if you like, if loans were granted, that there'd be an extension to the period during which those loans can be repaid. And we've seen that. If you look, one of the good things that I think governments have done right across the world is in terms of employee support systems, which in effect have kept people in jobs that didn't exist. If those support systems weren't there, I think unemployment levels would be way, way higher than they are. And that's been a good initiative that clearly comes at an economic cost, but it has significant economic value as well. And I know there's going to be big challenges to finance ministers as we come through this and come out of it to see how they can in effect, shore up their finances, given the amount of money that they've spent. But I think there is a recognition and a realization that, a global connected economy needs global connectivity provided by the air transport industry. And as I said, this technology is fine. It doesn't always work. And it's clearly not as good as meeting face to face, and the quality of interaction is nowhere near as good. We know ourselves that the quality of debate that we have doing it like this is not as good as when you can sit around a table and interact with people. We need to get back travelling again, and I expect governments to continue to provide support where it's necessary.
Great, thanks, Willie. We're just about at the top of the hour. If your schedule allows, we'll take a couple more questions.
Sure.
Okay. We've talked a lot about the passenger side of the business. There's a question about cargo and what you would see as the priorities for IATA in the area of cargo, and also asking if there's any update on our search for a new head of global cargo for IATA.
So we continue to look at how we manage our interaction with our members from the cargo point of view and what's the best structure internally for that. So that's one of the issues that we will be looking at. We did have a search process in train. It won't surprise people to know that I asked for those jobs that were being advertised and in process of being filled to put a hold on that, to give me an opportunity to consider whether I want to make any changes internally first. So I think that's something that I want to talk to people internally about, before I say anything externally. But I think there's still a lot that we can do to support the cargo business. Clearly we've made great progress on the passenger side of the business, removing a lot of the paperwork. We're still inundated with paper on the cargo side of the business. I think there's a lot that we can do. Again, it means, close working with governments and regulators to facilitate the digital cargo business that we need to get to, because there's far too much paperwork still in that side of the industry that I think is unnecessary today. We have electronic airway bills that have removed a lot of the paper, but in many cases we've not been as successful on the cargo side as we have on the passenger side. Clearly, as we rebuild, we would expect the situation with cargo to change, because as Brian demonstrated, we have a situation where demand is strong, but supply is constrained. That has led to, as you would expect, higher yields and higher charges for cargo. That will probably change. You would expect it to naturally change as more capacity becomes available. So I think this is a short-term benefit for cargo airlines and for passenger airlines who have cargo operations. But as Brian has said, the financial benefit that we're seeing on the cargo side is nowhere near enough to offset the financial challenge that we see on the passenger side. And we need to recognise that for a lot of our members, The passenger side of the business is by far the most important. It's not, cargo is important to all airlines that operate in that sphere, and we do have several cargo-only airlines who've done a fantastic job, making sure that the infrastructure remains in place. Because to be honest, and this is something that I think people have taken for granted. If you didn't have air freight operating the way it is, and if you didn't see cargo airlines respond by making additional freighters available, and passenger airlines making more cargo capacity available by either, putting larger aircraft on destinations where the passenger demand didn't justify what cargo volumes did, or in many cases, as we've seen, carrying cargo in the passenger cabin, well, then global supply chains would be in a very difficult situation. So I think the cargo side of our business has done an incredible job keeping global trade going. And the recovery that Brian showed, I don't think would be possible, and certainly would not be operating at the pace that it's operating without that supply chain. And we can see that from the critical goods that we're transporting as an industry. So I think we all have a debt of gratitude to both the cargo airlines and the passenger airlines who provided additional cargo capacity to ensure that economic activity has been able to continue and in some cases recover the way it has.
Okay, thanks, Willie. We have a few more questions still in the queue. We talked earlier about financial relief for the industry. There are a couple of questions about strings that are attached to that relief, particularly with respect to future M&A activities potentially, or return of slots, etc. So I guess the first is any comment on that, and the second is with respect to consolidation of the industry. Do you see the crisis as being a negative or a positive or neutral with respect to that?
Yes, there's a lot in that, and it's not a simple issue to address, because I think in the short term, if you look at M&A activity, I don't think there are many airlines who would want to use the cash that they have available, the liquidity that's available to them to acquire another airline in the current environment. There are some that I think may be prepared to do that and may feel confident about being able to access additional liquidity should they proceed that way. I think it's fair to say that there are some airlines that have struggled before this crisis, struggled through this, and may well be in a weak position afterwards, and there may be opportunities for consolidation there. But in the main, I think it's going to be a bit of time before we see a return to what I would call normal M&A activity within the industry and consolidation. So the industry is clearly smaller than it was. Strong airlines will probably look to take advantage of the gaps that have been left as airlines have been forced to, in many cases, trim their networks. And I think, some airlines will not be able to recover the networks that they operated prior to this crisis, which will give opportunities to others. So it'll take a little bit of time to stabilise. On slots, I think the slot alleviation measures that have been in place were absolutely critical. Without question, it would have been madness, to force airlines to operate flights to retain slots that will be essential to their recovery. So slot alleviation, I think, has been necessary for everybody. And even those airlines that have maybe argued that they would like to have seen slot alleviation removed, they would still want to see the slot rules applied, because what they would want is to get access to maybe slots that had to be given up, but then to be able to retain those slots into the future. So in other words, they want the use it or lose it facility to remain in place, because what they don't want to see is just a temporary acquisition of slots that they would then have to give up at some stage in the future. So I think the slot rules have worked well. I think slot alleviation measures have been a positive, and I think it's been necessary to see those measures in place.
Okay, thanks, Willie. We have a couple of questions on the regional situation. So particularly one set of questions around Latin America, another around Africa. So maybe we take Latin America first. How do you see the prognosis there, particularly given the pace of vaccine rollouts, etc.?
Yeah, it's clearly more challenging there. Certainly in some countries, the situation is more challenging than in others, and the measures that governments have had to introduce to manage the health crisis, I think, have been understood by everybody. I don't know if Brian wants to specifically comment on any of these markets. The issue is that that there isn't a single market operating globally, and every market has its own characteristics. But as we recover through this, I think the pace of recovery may be slightly different. What we need to ensure is that the environment post-recovery is the same everywhere. We need a set of global operating standards. We can't have completely different measures applying in certain parts of the world. So as I said, we need to get back to the environment that existed in 2019, where we're in effect looking at a single set of regulations applied by different regulators, but effectively a single set of regulations to enable the global network to operate in an efficient way. Brian, do you want to comment on any of the specific market trends that we're seeing?
Well, only to support what you've said. I think that in the Americas, we're seeing a very strong North American economy, obviously because of the pace of the vaccine rollout, the strength of the economy. A more difficult environment in Latin America, but they have got some big markets like Brazil, which have been very resilient in air travel terms.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Also, we had a couple of questions on Africa. Anything on the African market particularly that you would see?
Brian?
So we've actually seen the African market doing very well in the cargo business. Clearly the role of air transport across that continent has been critical in supplying goods, and that's been important for some airlines. And we've seen some of the travel barriers starting to come down, but actually travel remains very low, and in terms of international travel from the African continent, because of the slow vaccination rollout expected, I think that some of those markets will be limited for some time.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Another question on, we've asked for some measures to be removed as and when they're not necessary. But the questioner is asking about the cost of testing. And while testing is in place, do you see that as a major barrier to people being able to travel?
Well, it's a major cost. And, I don't know how many PCRs you've had. I think I've now had 5, maybe 6. I'm traveling again soon, so I have to have one tomorrow. So the cost of the test I'm doing tomorrow is 155 Swiss francs. I've had tests in the UK, Spain, Singapore, and Switzerland. They're all very expensive. The one that really shocked me, these are things that you should realise, but it's only when you see it. The amount of VAT I paid on the test that I did in the UK. So here's government saying you have to do a PCR, and they're benefiting from me doing a PCR. Now, I can understand why we need to have reassurance to facilitate travel at the moment. But, this is managing risk. And there are many other tests that are available at significantly lower prices that are just as efficient for the purpose of managing risk as a PCR, that are much more convenient for the customer, because anybody who's done the PCR test, it's not something you're going to queue up to want to do. So let's acknowledge that there's been huge advances in technology, testing technology, And we've produced, or we commissioned a report there recently, which is available on our website, which demonstrates that there are other forms of testing that are just as reliable, much faster, more convenient for the customer, and significantly cheaper. So if a family taking a holiday has to pay whatever it is, 155 Swiss francs or 120 pounds just to travel, that will be prohibitive for a lot of people, and that's wrong. It's particularly wrong when there are cheaper options available, and we see governments making money on the back of these tests. So they require you to do it, and you're actually paying VAT on it now. I'm sure they'll tell me there's international reasons why they have to charge VAT, but I just think that's wrong. To facilitate travel in a pandemic, to be charged VAT is a bit bizarre to me, and it's clear that the cost of these tests are way too high for most people. So that's an area that I think we need to push on, and I'm sure it's an area that there will be many others who would agree and will work with us to try and improve that situation.
Okay, thanks. We'll take just a couple more questions. I suppose more generally, how do you see vaccines and testing coming together to be able to facilitate a restart? Do you think that people should be required to be vaccinated as a prerequisite to fly? How do you see that whole system evolving over the next several months?
No, I personally do not believe it should be a requirement that you're vaccinated to fly, and I can understand why people are pushing back on this. Now, if you are vaccinated, should it be easier for you? Well, I think that's a different debate, but to mandate vaccination to facilitate flying, I think would be wrong. And, I think a robust testing system or vaccination or a combination of both should be acceptable to people. As you say, what we're doing here is we're managing risk. So, the situation whereby, if I travel into the UK, I have to do a test to prove I'm negative before I travel. You have to go into quarantine for 10 days. You have to do a test on day 2 and a test on day 8. And then after 10 days, you're released. So in that 10-day period, or we'll say a 12-day period, which includes the period before you traveled, you'll have taken 3 PCR tests that prove negative, but yet you've been, in effect, committed to house arrest for the period. That's we have to have a better system than that. And while I think people accept that there are risks and those risks need to be managed, and nobody wants to take unnecessary risk, I think we have to acknowledge that there are ways of facilitating safe travel in a much better way than we're currently experiencing. And that's why, we all have to resist the temptation that we just accept that this becomes the norm. It shouldn't be the norm. It's in place for a particular reason. Once that reason is removed, then, we should get back to normal.
Okay, thanks, Willie. I think we'll make the next question the last question for today. And the question basically refers to you, Willie, as IATA's first former pilot who's taking over as Director General. So first is, what does the role of pilot mean to the role of Director General? Does that give you any special insights, advantages, unique capabilities in your current role? And also, given what's happened to many thousands of pilots in this crisis, would you recommend that as a career path for young people these days?
I don't think being a former pilot gives me any particular advantage. I've often talked before that one of the things that it has done for me is it certainly made me more focused on decision making, because as a pilot, and particularly as a captain, you have to be prepared to take decisions. You have to be able to assess information quickly. You have to be able to manage risk and take decisions in a structured way. And I think that is something that every leader needs to do. But having done that as a pilot, I think it's certainly made it easier for me to embrace difficult challenges and make decisions quickly when I've needed to do that in my role as a CEO, and I would expect to do the same in my role as a Director General. Would I recommend the career of a pilot? Absolutely. I joined the industry 41, nearly 42 years ago. Back then, there was talks of a pilot shortage, a pilot surplus. We've gone through cycles over the years. Things will recover, and it's an exciting industry. It's a challenging and rewarding job, and I would definitely recommend it to everybody. I would particularly recommend it to young girls considering a future career. We need to attract more women into the industry, particularly into roles that were traditionally seen as being male-dominated. There's no reason why going forward we shouldn't see a 50-50 mix when it comes to people applying to become trainee pilots. It's clearly something that the industry needs to work to do, and it's something that IATA will continue to focus on. We've got a good initiative in place, 25 by 25, and we'll continue to to push this agenda to make sure our industry is attractive to everybody in the future.
Great. Thanks very much, Willie. We still have a few questions in the queue, but I think we've covered most of the major areas where people have been asking questions. Where people have identified themselves, we'll get back to you with specific comments on the residual questions. But for now, thank you everybody for joining. Really appreciate your support. We'll continue with these media briefings on a regular basis. So please look for the invite in your mailbox, and we look forward to speaking with you again soon.